Now I request Mr. Shekhar Shah to give his presentation.
Thank you, Shayamal. After that spirited set of comments from Yamini about state capacity, I'm left quivering because our problems run so deep. I was given the task, or I took on the task of talking about agriculture, partly because NCER, my institution, has been working with the Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. And we are part of the Doubling Farmers Income Committee, and my colleague, Dr. Rajesh Chadda, is here, who's very active in that role. The bottom line message here is entirely consistent with what Shayamal started out. There are two budgets here. And I think you see that in agriculture perhaps even more clearly than anywhere else. And so whatever else you take away from what I'm going to say, effectively we will see that there is a very good game of smoke and mirrors that happened in this budget. And Yamini is right that, of course, it happens in every budget. But this one was the last real budget that we had from this government. And so one had thought that perhaps that quotient of smoke and mirrors might be lower than in other budgets prior to that, but probably it's been the reverse. So the key trends, first, of course, the extreme variability in growth rates because of rainfall dependency, and secondly, the fact that the gross capital formation in agriculture has been declining. The economic survey, which of course as in the last few years is an excellent document again, puts this down to the reduction in private investment. There are 5 key challenges in agriculture as we see it, and this comes out of some of our work with the Doubling Farmers Income Committee. Price fluctuations, lack of infrastructure, inability to guard against risk, poor technology, and poor receptivity to technology. These are all very deep-seated, difficult, problematic areas. Countries such as the United States still struggle with some of these things, of course, with tremendous resources that they can throw at some of these problems. These have been with us for a very long time. We've had the MSP as one answer to this, a number of variety of different schemes, now a turn to digital technology to allow us to be able to leapfrog into the ability to move to a higher level of productivity, but these are the key challenges. And the objectives that this government set itself: one, diversify income so that subsectors could come up, such as livestock and fisheries, and to move from crop to non-crop, to mitigate risk, and of course to improve productivity. And we've just listed the top, I guess what, this is 8 schemes, which account for 95% of the allocation in the budget on trying to deal and attain some of these 3 key objectives. And we tried to give you a sense of what might have an impact. The first budget the first pillar of the agricultural discussion in this budget, of course, is about doubling farmers' income. It's always been understood that this is an aspiration. The way that we have worked with the ministry is to parse this aspiration and come up with what might have to be done to at least get to some notion of increasing farmers' income. And that's really the way we have approached it. Of course, the problem is that in this game of smoke and mirrors, the desire to prove that, yes, we will double farmers' income sometimes really exceeds our ability to even think this through. And so that's always a constant tension in our discussions with the government. But that clearly is the motivating factor, and it certainly is a good way of thinking about how one can improve farm productivity and how we can improve non-farm activities in the rural sector. The second pillar, of course, is the boosting of infrastructure and eventually employment. Manrega, of course, still is very much the bedrock of our thinking about how we can ensure households will have a decent livelihood, but beyond that, the desire very much is to be able to increase employment as well. And so we've seen a boost in expenditure on the rural sector, both in absolute terms and in percentage terms. These are some of the big schemes. The biggest, of course, is the interest subsidy, and I'll go through a few of these very quickly. Then the Green Revolution scheme, which is intended to improve productivity, and of course the crop insurance scheme, which has been with us for quite a while, and which has some basic problems which haven't really been addressed. The interest subsidy on short-term credit has the largest share in total expenditures proposed, 15,000 crores. Unfortunately, it has, again, going back to the issues of state capacity that Yamini referred to, a lot of different problems. First, problem that large farmers will borrow at subsidized rates to invest in their own higher return schemes, or actually become bankers to the farmers who do not have access or who are unbanked. And there is, unfortunately, even after some work on this by the RBI and others, no real framework to monitor and evaluate. And again, this is a constant, I think, a constant theme in a lot of public policy making and implementation. We go to scale too quickly. We do not pilot. We do not experiment. We do not learn from those pilots and experiments. And in the end, we commit ourselves to a lot of money without guarantee of a good return. I think this perhaps is one of the casualties of that tendency that has been with us for a very long time. Other countries, particularly large countries, don't do this. And I guess the clearest example is our neighbor China, which always, inevitably, pilots, experiments, learns, and then scales up. The big scheme for Green Revolution is, or the Green Revolution 2 is what I guess we should say, is to improve productivity. It's the integration of all of the inputs into agricultural productivity. The potential is to raise productivity by 30%, very aspirational, given the nature of the small holdings that we have. But there again, we have seen an increase in the allocation for this. I mentioned the crop insurance scheme, and I just listed some of the potential benefits at the bottom, but also the inherent risks. And this slide, I have to admit, is really a copy from a slide that I did 2 years back, and things haven't changed. So the highly correlated nature of risk in agriculture is really a very difficult thing to handle under most situations. And of course, it beguiles the current system as well. And there's moral hazard. Subsidizing premiums will encourage risk-taking. If risk-taking is not sensible, it's just a sort of a satta, then in the end, of course, it ends up being a problem, and a systemic problem rather than just an individual problem. The increase in the MSP is the big news in this budget. The 50% increase over the cost of production. I need not go into the sleight of hand here in terms of what is the cost of production. From everything that we see, it's going to be what's called the A2 plus the imputed cost of family labor. A2 is the paid out costs, plus you impute an element of family labor, but it does not address the imputed costs of land that is owned by the family, as well as the imputed interest cost of any capital that's deployed. So in some ways, we are looking at an increase in MSP, but we are not really looking at it as any farmer would. And of course, this goes back to the two-budget question. There are not any allocations here that actually will fund this. These are all going to be NABARD-type windows that will potentially fund this, but this is all off budget. So in some sense, this is a big flag that's being waved at agriculture, and clearly that flag is going to be waved, as somebody said. This is a political, but with POLL budget. So it's really a budget that's intended to look at the polls when they happen. In a sense, the doubling farmers' income recommendations have really not been implemented. There was a very clear recommendation, and is a very clear recommendation, to collect data on the actual harvest prices paid. Because we currently have those prices with a very large lag, and they're only available at the district or the state level. We need to think about how the private sector can be part of this mechanism of supporting agricultural prices. And we need to be able to incentivize startups in the agricultural sector that are directly sourcing from farm gate to the either through a supply chain system or in some other way to be supplying to end consumers. So these are the things that haven't really been dealt with. Again, going back to some of the hand waving and the flag waving that has been very prevalent in this budget. Go back to two other schemes that are in there in the budget that have been talked about in previous years. The notion of dealing with the agricultural market problems and the fact that the APMCs still constrain the ability of farmers to get good returns. The notion that we will have an electronic market, a digital market for farm produce sales in the country. It's happening to some extent, but certainly in the budget, the harmonization of all the various standards that are required for a digital platform to work hasn't yet happened. And so this is a major hurdle in getting to a national digital farm market, and much more needs to be done. Again, this goes back, and I'm reminded again of Yamini's statement about the lack of state capacity. If we don't go through the initial steps and create the foundations for such a market, it's highly unlikely that it will function the way it is supposed to function. Irrigation has had a big boost in this budget with the Krishi Sanchai Yojana receiving a significant additional boost. Again, remains to be seen how effectively this will be implemented in the years to come. This is clearly one of the key elements of the doubling farmers' income. So on agriculture, the conclusion is that the budget has followed some of the recommendations of the doubling farmers' income group. There's a push towards non-crop farming, high-value crops as well, but a focus on animal husbandry and fishing, and looking to both improving credit as well as irrigation in the run-up to trying to improve farm outcomes in this. I was also going to spend a little time on infrastructure, though it's implicit in a lot of the discussion that has happened already. These are the major infra schemes that have found mention in the 2018-19 budget. There's an increase in the allocation from about 5 lakh crore to 6 lakh crore. The bulk of it going again to highways and to housing and to rural infrastructure. The key trends in infrastructure, again, unfortunately, in the short run, suggest the problems that we have in abundance and that seem to persist. CapEx for new projects declined precipitously in the last few quarters, and the stalled projects show much variation. So we don't seem to yet have a mechanism for dealing with these issues, and I think that is going to be a crying need in the years to come if we are going to be looking to infrastructure to create jobs, to facilitate the ease of doing business, and of course the ease of living, especially in urban infrastructure. The focus on rural infrastructure has had 4 different legs. Rural spending has increased or is proposed to be increased. The Gram Sadak Yojana, of course, the Awas Yojana, the rural housing, supposed to be a catalyst for reviving industries, and the digital infrastructure with the notion that we can leapfrog and have connectivity in rural India that will vastly improve both the flow of information as well as the ability to connect to metropolises. There is clearly a desire to converge rural and urban infrastructure, and you can see that in terms of the way in which the National Highways Authority of India's works are supposed to be linked to the, what's the new word coined, Rurban, R-U-R, I never know how to pronounce that, infrastructure, and the Sagarmala and the promotion of digital payments. And this, of course, is tied to GST, where we hope the GST is going to substantially reduce logistics costs. The one development that isn't reflected in the budget that I should mention is that the Ministry of Commerce and Industries actually set up a division of logistics, which is got very little spending power, but has a great deal of coordinating power which emanates directly from the Prime Minister's office. And the hope very much is that this division, which is headed by a union secretary, will have the wherewithal to force roads, ports, indirect taxes, to bring them together and sort out the issues that are beguiling the high logistics costs still in Indian industry as well as in Indian farming. And so that's a very positive development, but it's of course not reflected in the budget. And finally, there's a big push towards digital infrastructure, with a lot of hand-waving towards artificial intelligence, machine learning, IoT, 3D printing. All the buzzwords are here. The worry that many of us have is when we haven't really got basics right, we face the vulnerability of not being able to focus on those basics, because we must be ticking off these boxes at the cutting edge of technology. And this is a very fundamental problem where India is both dealing with problems of a low-income country as well as wanting to be very much at the cutting edge of a middle-income country. This is a very strange situation for a country as large as India to be in. Countries like South Korea and others, Taiwan, who pretty much were at the same level of per capita income as us in the 1950s, effectively solved these low-income problems in the 60s and perhaps latest by the 70s. So they are now in a position where they don't need to deal with rural sanitation, they don't need to deal with Swachh Taiwan campaigns and things like that. The trouble is we are straddling these 2 or 3 horses at the same time, trying to deal with these basic fundamental problems of public service delivery, at the same time trying to avoid the kinds of problems that countries who seem to have fallen into the middle income trap, where their low wage cost advantage no longer serves them well, but they have to be innovating, they have to be producing knowledge, they have to be producing new intellectual property. Those are the kinds of issues that you confront when you get to $10,000 per capita, $8,000 per capita. But because of the scale of our country, we obviously have to deal with those as well. And I think this is going to be a hidden challenge, along with our demography of being one of the youngest populations in the world, and with a young cohort coming into the labor force, of dealing with this, having to straddle 2 horses at the same time. I don't think our politicians are sufficiently aware of the dangers that lurk 5, 7, 10 years from now, when, if we haven't managed to keep our balance on both, we will be in somewhat even bigger trouble than we are now. Thank you very much.
You talked large details about agriculture as well as rural infrastructure. I think the government has thrown many balls in the air, of which this agriculture is one of them. We'll discuss this as we go along. Now,